You're listening to Hangar Frequency Podcast by Execaire Aviation.
All right, everyone, welcome back. This is episode 3. We're talking now about the future of business aviation and the environment. We're at Execaire's facility in Montreal, and with us to my left, the team at Azzera, and to my right, the team at Execaire. The first 2 episodes, the first was dealing with the framework of business aviation, the environment, and sustainability. The second was the costs related to the programs, the options that are available, the menu of choices that you have. Today, and in this episode, what we want to do is talk a little bit about the future. What does it look like if there's a new government, if it's the same government? What does business aviation look like in the future? So we're going to start into that realm. But let's start first with this idea of perhaps it's 2035. Maybe if I could start with the team at Azzera. In your view, thinking about the future of these programs, whether it's EU ETS, CORSIA, any future obligations of Canada, or other places across the globe. In 2035, what do those programs look like? What are some of the things that you want to see need to happen in order for these programs to either continue to mature or change to reflect the needs of the industry? So if you could forecast a little bit forward, these programs, what they look like, and how we across the globe are interfacing on these issues.
Okay, I mean, I can start with the compliance schemes. EU ETS, as I mentioned in the first episode, is perceived as a success, right? So they're now advertising 47% reduction in emissions since 2005 as a result, a direct result of the EU ETS program. Now, that doesn't relate to aviation. Actually, aviation in the last, I think, 2 years has increased 5% in its emissions, because we're now rebounding from COVID. But ultimately, I think EU ETS will just continue. It's quite a mature compliance program when we compare to CORSIA. And I think it'll just continue. They will eventually remove, right now they give free allowances. There's free allowances in circulation. Those will be removed from the system, which will then put more strain on those members of the EU ETS system to have to comply. So more cost burden, which will force and drive, I think, behavioral changes in terms of operational changes in technology, changes in, when it comes to aviation, more reliance on SAF, if possible, right? So I see it happening. I see there's targets. I think the EU will definitely lead the way internationally. Will we reach what they would hope? I'm not sure. These are stretch targets, but I think they have a pretty proven track record of having a hard line. And that hard line, when compared to North America, is working. Like it or not. Economically, it's not the best, but it is working from an emissions reduction point of view, or emissions mitigation point of view, and changing behavior. On the CORSIA side, it's more challenging, as we've discussed. There's 124 member states, which will grow after 27. I think ICAO has over 200 countries involved in ICAO, so all of them will be participating in CORSIA. It's a big challenge. I'm interested to see how it pans out. It's hard to, and we don't have a crystal ball. We have yet to have a compliance phase, like a final compliance where we have to submit carbon credits. I'm interested to see what happens there. To purchase and retire carbon credits. We have yet to see how SAF plays into the compliance schemes, and whether book and claim will be introduced. So a lot has to be done between now and 2035 in order for us to drive results and changes on a global scale. I think technology is definitely a solution. It always is. I'm an engineer. I want technology to be the solution. It's going to be a long game. So 2035 is ambitious, but we're hopefully heading in the right direction.
What do you both think about the idea of offsets or technology? So expressed as like some view of percentage, let's say go to 2035. What's making the bigger difference? And at what point can you look into that crystal ball that we're trying to find? But can you think from between now and 2035, is it offsets or technology? Where is there a break point, if at all, in terms of our goal of reducing aviation's emissions overall? I mean, these programs are there and in place to track that, to measure them, to offset them. But where do you think offsets or technology come in? And if you think of technology, is there a band of technology that you think would be first? Is it electric aircraft, hydrogen aircraft? What solutions do you think will come about in that scenario?
Yeah, I can take the first step. I think going back to Patrick, what he said, right? So CORSIA as a program is here to kind of nudge operators into grabbing those low-hanging fruits first. So when it comes to operational efficiency, looking at your own operations and saying, let's try to reduce APU usage. Let's bring in some electric ground processing units, ground power units. So I think those kind of low-hanging fruits will be realized by 2035. We're in this place where those have been captured. However, I feel like this part is maybe a bit more, maybe not annoying, but a bit more controversial, which is, demand management, which is, can we continue to fly the same amount or even more than we already do today, right? I feel like a lot of these programs will, at 2035, be like, okay, great. So SAF is working. We have some SAF. Carbon credits work. We have some carbon credits, but aviation emissions are still growing. So more people are flying in the developing countries. Everyone else taking a flight now for short haul trips, long haul trips, multiple vacations a year, 3 to 5 of them. It's not having the same impact as it should have had. And that's where I came across a few interesting concepts, one of them being a frequent flyer levy. So saying, if you unnecessarily take too many flights a year, if you take 5 vacations a year, you should probably pay a bit more for your air tickets, because you're kind of depriving a future generation from using a flight or having access to an airplane because you today want to take extra vacations. So I'm a strong proponent for that as well, because I think we cannot just control it by reducing CO2. We also need to reduce how much we fly in a measurable way.
Now, what do you think about and maybe building on that, it's when you think of the emission structure, I mean, we talk a lot about aviation, right? Obviously, that's what we're here to do at Execaire's facility in Montreal. But think about road transport. I'm curious to know, because while aviation can be seen as the very visible thing, I mean, we hear some of the aircraft depart occasionally, but at least in Canada, in terms of just transportation emissions, road transport plays a significant role. If, for example, this path of aviation continues, what kind of markers should we be seeing on the other solutions, whether it's rail, whether it's road, in terms of emissions reductions? I think that might be an important. What do you sort of view in that area? How are other sectors of this transportation industry doing relative to aviation? Or will it always be the case that aviation is that focus and that attention?
Yeah, well, business aviation in particular, as we know, is always in the spotlight because it's seen as a luxury, right? So by the general population, business aviation always seems to have the spotlight. In Europe, as we've seen, way more than the rest of the world. Transportation as a whole, aviation is one small part of transportation. Definitely rail and road transportation and shipping
Exactly.
the vast majority of emissions. There are, for example, for shipping, shipping is subject to the same emissions compliance in Europe that aviation is, EU ETS. And they're far more penalized than we are because they have more emissions in general. Road and rail there's still a long way to go. We just have more of a spotlight on ourselves. But I would like to say, like, rather than like have only negative connotations here, aviation has done significant work in reducing emissions, and we need to recognize that. I don't want to sound like the CBAA and NBAA, but we have to advocate for ourselves as well, right? These compliance schemes are complicated, but they're meant for us to demonstrate action. However, back to your question about technology, engine efficiency, improved aerodynamics. For years, aviation has always been in the forefront of that, and investing in that. That's sort of our sector signature, particularly business aviation, where there's a motivation to invest in operational efficiency through the technology, through the design and development of aircraft.
Absolutely. And it's something that we celebrate, certainly, the idea of the first composite use aircraft, business aviation, engine design, the life cycle, the change in terms of total lifespan of an aircraft changes more in aviation. That allows us to take advantage of the environmental wins, safety wins.
Right.
So let's take that approach then and think about the future of business aviation from Execaire's standpoint. Let's think about technology and solutions. Maybe Patrick, from your side, operationally, you talked about in episode 2, the approaches you take, the levers you pull that you have direct control over. But thinking into the future, what does business aviation look like at Execaire? And then George, from a client perspective, ultimately, how do they view the new solutions? What are the problems that you anticipate them having? And how will Execaire, let's say, solve that solution? Or solve that problem, I should say, with a solution. So Patrick, to you, how do you view the future in business aviation operations, new aircraft and operations?
Well, one of the things that I found is been very beneficial from CORSIA's implementation is that we're actually having the conversation about these things, right? And it's the same thing when we implemented SMS at this company, and change takes time. It just takes time. And if you try and steamroll change, you will just grow the amount of detractors about the process. So for me, in the realm of influence that I have, we've now, for example, we have annual meetings with all of our pilots. We go to each base, we meet with them all, and now we actually have a sustainability presentation where we talk about these concepts. We introduce the concepts. We look at the pilot programs that we had, the success that we've had, and just by talking about it, pilots may make different decisions. For example, myself, when I fly the Challenger, especially in Europe, I'll ask if a GPU is available. Right? So I can, instead of running my APU for an hour and a half before the client shows up, I set the airplane up using ground power, right? And in Europe, most of the ground power is electric GPUs and so on and so forth. So it's actually it has an effect, right? And the larger the aircraft, the larger that effect is. So we just talking about these things and introducing those concepts, I think, is critical. Continuing the conversation is very critical. When I look at problems now, I look at problems with a sustainability lens. When I talk about aircraft operation, and when I meet with with the OEMs, and when I meet with, even here, when we meet with our infrastructure committee, we now have a component of that, which is, okay, how do we change our infrastructure? When we develop infrastructure, how do we do that in a more with sustainability in mind? And an example of that is one of the things that we've been recently talking about is I fly into Nice a lot. I fly into Stockholm quite a bit. And in Europe, they now have ground power that comes right out of the ground. It's ironic, but basically in Nice, they tow you to your starting location, and a little trap door opens, and you pull out a ground power, you plug it in your plane, and it's just ground power. Right? It's fantastic. Now Nice, has the benefit of a very moderate climate, right? In Canada, sometimes we're not that lucky. I'm not going to be ground powering the airplane at minus 30. At some point you need heat, right? So it's not always applicable. But we have been talking about it in our infrastructure committee here at Execaire to install, ground power, electrical outlets on the ramp. That aircraft, when they're on departure position, could just use ground power when that is possible, where the weather is not significantly problematic, and so on and so forth. So we've looked at strategies, on that front. Also, too, it is influenced our aircraft sales strategy, right? So, and how we interact with the OEMs. Execaire being a large operator, we have a pretty big voice with Bombardier. We have a pretty big voice with Embraer, and so on and so forth. A lot of our pilots are on our advisory committees with these OEMs. And in my opinion, again, take it for what it is. I really believe that aircraft technology has a significant role to play in the future. Hydrogen powered aircraft, we talked about electric aircraft. The problem with electric aircraft is that the range is just not there. The payload is not there, right? And that's always been an issue with aviation. You need something with a higher energy output. So hydrogen power is a possibility, and I'd be interested to hear Anant's position on that and the logistical issues with that. So we do operate, for example, the Global 7500 at Execaire, right? And I'm a Challenger pilot, and I was having a chat with the lead captain on that Global 7500, and we were talking about fuel consumption. And I said, so how much fuel does this airplane? This is a 110,000 pound airplane, right? And he said, oh, it's it's about 2,000 pounds per hour or something like that. I'm like, man, that's basically the exact same thing as a Challenger. And so, they've done great things with that airplane. The wingspan's 110 feet. It's got super efficient engines, and basically for double the payload or double the weight of the aircraft, you can emit the same emissions as you would on a Challenger 605, 650. So if you look at the Falcon 6X, if you look at the Falcon 8X, if you look at all these new aircraft that are coming out, sustainability, knowing that sustainability is not a threat, the number one threat in my mind to business aviation and its future and its growth is making our operation more sustainable, because we do have a spotlight on us. Whether that is fair or unfair, the spotlight is there, and we could have a long discussion about whether that's fair or not, but we do have that spotlight on us, and we have to find ways to shift that spotlight to show our successes, number one, and also make sure that we understand that that's a threat to us, and then in our decisions, in our discussions with the OEMs and with the things that we can control, to make sure that sustainability is a key component.
Correct. I think the answer to like the future is a little bit of everything. Now, aviation has outlined a roadmap, right, of how to get to net zero, which includes market-based measures, SAF, new technology, operational efficiency. And actually, every operator has to sit down. The first thing is you cannot manage what you don't measure. So you have to you need to know how much your emissions are. What's your carbon footprint of your operation? What's your carbon footprint of your aircraft? And then you can execute on a plan. But absolutely, the OEMs are driving a lot of that in terms of in terms of efficiency in the technology of the aircraft. In business aviation, the trend for several years now, many years now, has been to go to wide-body aircraft, longer range aircraft. So electric aircraft are not necessarily the solution for business aviation. It helps from a domestic point of view, taxis, internal, short-haul flights. Definitely in Europe, they're looking at that as an alternative. They're really trying to dissuade short-haul flights, particularly France. But hydrogen and hybrid aircraft are probably where the future of business aviation will be, but it won't be 2035.
Yeah.
It's going to be a little bit further from that.
So maybe, George, tying that in with the customers, the clients that you talk to, when they think about the aircraft of their future, what are some of the qualities or the characteristics they're looking for? Are they asking for the latest in technology? Where are they at in terms of that experience?
Well, I reflect my 35 years in aviation, right? My 7 years at Canadian and Pratt & Whitney, and 17 here at Execaire. And I look at aviation in general. The concept hasn't changed, right? And what has changed is the technology, right? And the efficiency of the aircraft. So, and we look at our own fleet of 45 planes, and on average, the retention to time span on an aircraft is anywhere from, I think it's getting longer. It's probably every 10 years that they're keeping their aircraft, or at least 10 years before they go on to the next latest and greatest technology. So I think the customers are definitely eager to see what's coming in the future. They're always looking at the newest, greatest, and best performing aircraft out there, especially if it's going to reduce their operating cost. But are we at a state where we're going to go in 10 years have hydrogen planes or electric planes? No, I think it's not in our, at least not in my lifespan. But I think we'll eventually get there, but not in the next 10 years. So hopefully the adaptation of SAF is going to be more.
That's why SAF and carbon credits are actually important. Compliance schemes are actually important because they're things we can control in a way. We can do. We can measure our emissions. We can introduce operational efficiencies, and we can allow the OEMs to introduce new changes to improve our efficiencies.
And I really do hope, and this is something I spoke about in episode 2, but I want to reiterate it because, again, there's only so many levers that I can pull. Yeah. Right. There needs to be a holistic strategy, because it is so, like, emissions is so, it touches so many, how it's extracted, how it's produced, how it's shipped, how it's stored, how it's used. There's so many components of that. If there's no one that has a holistic strategy on how we take the entire supply chain, right? And make that more efficient. We've talked about that, but if no one has a holistic review strategy on that, it's going to be very challenging to get to the targets. Very challenged.
And it's not just that the burden is not just on operators, to your point. MROs, FBO, the business aviation ecosystem, the aviation ecosystem, airports, MROs, FBOs, fuel suppliers, they all play a part.
Yeah. We have looked also too, like Execaire, when I talk about, the conversation, right? So we've started having the conversation. People are now more aware of these things. It's part of now their decision-making matrix, right? So we look at, we're replacing a lot of our ground service equipment. Okay. So, let's look at electric GSE, right? Okay. Are there any governmental programs to allow us or entice us to purchase electrical GSE? I don't know. No, not really. Right. So, that's a missed opportunity. Like we will likely do it anyways because, sustainability is a value of the company. But, if we have to move in unison as an industry, there has to be some type of, enticing factor, to that. So I think that's a missed opportunity, from the government, right? So the government has great ideas. When it comes time to execute the ideas, a lot of time they're missing in action, right? And they put the burden on the operator, and it's challenging. It's very difficult.
Don't forget the CBAA to lobby. Right?
Yeah, well, see, this is the question. We are now still taping at the end of March, so we have an election coming around the corner. And one of the things we've asked for is a comprehensive aviation strategy, not just about business aviation, but about the entire ecosystem. Yeah. The way we fund the airports, the way we have Nav Canada interface, the way aviation operators, the entire system needs to be reviewed. And from that, you could have the conversation and the commitment to these other strategies. So maybe bringing that full circle, we've had the opportunity to talk in episode 1 about the framework of business aviation and sustainability. Episode 2, we talk about costs. As we look to wrap episode 3, thinking of the future, maybe the question I want to ask you is, waving a magic wand. The idea that if you could influence a bit of technology today or a process or just change something, is there something that stands out in terms of just a clear and obvious win? And it doesn't have to be something revolutionary. Sometimes, I think we alluded to earlier, it's the low-hanging fruit. I mean, Patrick, you just talked about electrical ground service equipment and just the win that can have. But anything else that you're thinking of, is there any sort of magic wand, simple, smart idea that you think about that others yet haven't contemplated that may move the needle even further?
I think it really has to start with, to Patrick's point, federal government initiatives. Mm-hmm. So the U.S. government introduced the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, which supports the production of SAF by providing a tax deduction for that production. What does that do? It drives farmers and to provide feedstock. It's good for the economy. It's good for those farmers because they're selling waste feedstock to drive SAF production, which allows for more SAF production and allows for more SAF to be sold, right? And then this can also drive economies of scale and lowering price. In Canada, we don't have such an incentive program. An incentive program for buying GSE, electric GSE, would be fantastic. These small changes that are specific, but then everyone can get on board, it's going to drive change. We have over 400 operators in Canada. If every operator was accessing some sort of incentive to do some sustainable activity, they would do it.
You move the needle. Exactly.
I think that's really an easy one.
Yeah, absolutely. Anant, anything from your...
So I think I'll reflect in terms of how the role that SAF really plays and what's missing really in this thing. So I've seen several forecasts that have happened over the last few years for, what's going to be aviation's silver bullet, right? But I think we realize there is no one single solution, right? It has to be a multitude of them. But if the largest solution here is SAF, right? Now within SAF, there are some concerns. The first one is we can definitely use the existing mature production pathways to make enough SAF for 10% of aviation's demand. But how do we go from 10% to 65, 70%? That gap is just too huge. So there is a lot of dependence here on untested technologies, commercially not viable today. For example, Fischer-Tropsch, where you can actually take directly captured CO2, introduce some hydrogen into it and make SAF. And you call it a synthetic fuel. Now, it's quite likely that we are saying that it's going to be available by 2035, 2040. It's going to be in a vast amount of volume. But today, it's completely not available. So the first production facilities for Fischer-Tropsch fuel will come out only 27, 28, which means we are depending so much on one solution, yet it's a bit untested, right? So that's a big concern in my mind. And if I had a wand, I would definitely, put it on synthetic SAF and say, okay, can we have it today? Can we have the most of it today available? I think there are multiple issues within why it's not there, and I'll address your question on hydrogen. So the thing with hydrogen really is, again, it has the same SAF issue, which is it's not available too much today, and it's too expensive to make. You can make hydrogen out of synthetic, out of methane, for example, for the process called steam reforming. But it's not great because then you're using a fossil fuel to make hydrogen. It's not serving your purpose. And with green hydrogen, it's too expensive. So you're looking in the 6 times the price of gray hydrogen. Gray hydrogen meaning methane converted to hydrogen. So you have an issue of making synthetic fuels because you have to introduce clean hydrogen, which is already expensive. So the price of synthetic fuels is even more expensive. So that's where I think it's going to be a big challenge to go from 10% SAF to 65, 70% SAF. And I think that's where I would wave the magic wand there.
Or throw the mining.
No, I appreciate that both. So then maybe shifting to the team at Execaire. So waving a magic wand, fixing a solution that you would otherwise see. What do you see, or what would you like to influence?
Yeah. I kind of take a not a slow as you go approach, but what are the things that I can control, right? And that's what I need to spend my efforts on, right? So from a silver bullet standpoint, I agree with Anant completely, is that there is not one solution, one magic thing that's going to happen. I think, aircraft technology is a really key component of that. I do think that changing the ATS network and making the the airspace more efficient, perhaps through the use of AI, to real time recalculate the most efficient. Like I don't even know statistically, what that would entail. Like I know that when they implemented constant descent profiles at the FAA, which is a significant. That's why the FAA has. In Canada, we don't do that because we're just, from an air traffic control network, airspace design standpoint, we're not there yet, unfortunately. We've been putting a lot of pressure on them to work on that. But in the United States, for example, they have a lot of descend via stars, right? So standard terminal arrivals with constant descent rates. So you leave 410 and you get to 5,000 feet basically at the runway, and the engines, they just stay basically, not at idle, but they don't move a lot, right? There's no leveling off. There's no, so that has a significant impact on overall fuel usage when you look at the amount of movement. So I think that is a really critical piece that is being unfortunately overlooked. And when we talk about greenwashing, right, like what is difficult for me to accept sometimes as well is that there are organizations that will, do a little bit of hand waving, right? So, we've done, this is something that has come up in Toronto, where they implemented a new approach procedure, an RMPAR approach to one of the runways. And there's this big marketing campaign that was put out about, we're going to save fuel and all this kind of stuff. But the reality is the majority of aircraft can't use it. It's not significantly included in the daily operation. It's kind of used, it's not really used all the time. So the net effect of that is not significant, if at all. So I think we really need to there needs to be a lot of pressure put on the ATS network to say, you guys control a lot of, diversions and holdings and altitude assignments and all this kind of stuff. So better usage of the airspace is combined with aircraft technology improvements, and that was one of the big things that really helped the airline front is when the 787 came out. The 787 was one of the first airliners that was able to get above 390, right? And they can fly 42, 430, right? But that difference, right, is huge. Most airliners like 777s or crossing the ocean are between the 35, 38, depending on where they are in their profile. But 787 is basically crossing at 410. Right. So that really and when we talk about best bang for your buck, I keep using that word, but it really is like, we have to really kind of try and target where we're going to get the most, because in my world, it's emission avoidance, right? That's really my scope of what I do, right? Is how do I avoid emissions? And that, being able to, climb higher, use the airspace more efficiently, have aircraft that burn less fuel because of improved technologies, better engines, better wing design. To me, that is somewhat of an unsung hero in this whole piece, right? It's something that's now. It's not a pipe dream. It's not fictional, right? It's not untested. It's there. It's just we need to dedicate the time and effort to say, look, you need to redesign your airspace. It's not acceptable that we are not at that point, because that has significant impact on emissions, right? So when we talk about operator focus, right, like I keep saying, is that the operator is under the magnifying glass about how are you controlling your emissions, but the air traffic control network, for example, is without no one pays attention to that, but it has a significant impact.
But who's orchestrating all that, right? Who's overseeing it and who's taking the lead? And I think everybody's doing their own part, but is there one person overseeing it?
Because it's international, it's so daunting. Like ICAO has introduced CORSIA, but they're not overseeing air traffic control, all of the airports, all of the FBI, and the whole ecosystem. There's who can speak for the entire international ecosystem?
Well, I think in the end, we've talked, and George, I still want to go to you for some comments, but specifically on this one, I would say that to be an agent of change, one needs to participate. Yeah. You need to be in the conversations. You need to be part of that voice. In the absence of it, you are just reacting to the world that is presented to you. So when it comes to what we're doing in Canada, they're absolute, whether it's our association, other associations in aviation in Canada. So the attention and focus, Patrick, what you're talking about is having all the cylinders firing at the same time. And so much that it's not necessarily eliminating emissions. You're talking about strategically reducing emissions, because we've got work to do. That's what our customers are doing when they're flying the aircraft. They've got stuff to get done. And in comparison to the commercial alternatives, when we do the time cost benefit, business aviation still wins. So I want to leave it maybe to George when you're thinking about the Clyde.
One last thing, okay? Because again, I'm going to forget, okay? Anant had said something before about a passenger levy for high flyers, okay? So coming back to a comment I made earlier in episode 2 is that, you have to be careful about that kind of implementation, because it is a, I don't know how to phrase this properly, but if you're going to start telling people they can't do something, right? But you have not done everything possible to allow them to do that, you grow your detractor volume significantly. 100%. Right? So if you're going to tell me, look, man, you can't fly because you can't, there's too much emissions and this and that. But then I learn that, the air traffic control network hasn't been rejuvenated in 10 years, or we're using technology from 40 years ago and we haven't implicated AI into better approach profiles and departure profiles and all this kind of stuff. I can't support that, because now what it means is we're starting to limit ourselves because we haven't done the work necessary to permit ourselves. And that is a real thing that I constantly fight against. I fight against that with the airports. I fight against that with the regulator, is that before we start saying no to people, we need to be really sure that we've done everything possible to make sure that no is like the end.
I agree. Yeah.
It's my favorite story is I've used this in previous corporations, but it was a line that, when you point a finger at somebody, there's 3 that point back at you. Yeah. Now, what we operationalize, the thing that I love to do is, if I point a finger at a person, a process, a system, a regulator, whatever, the things that I've got to look back is, have I provided the tools, the technology, and the training? Those three fingers that point back at me. So if you really want to be a geek, the way I view it is, have we done the best to provide the tools to our teams? Conversations across, all your bases, conversations with clients across the globe. Do we have the requisite training? Do we understand why this is a bit of a problem right now? And even if you don't think it's a problem, it's a regulatory issue, which might then, in your mind, view it as a, quote, problem. And the last thing is, do we have the appropriate training? So I think those are some important factors. And look, you've listened to 3 episodes, and what we've tried to do here is but scratch the surface. Let's say plant the seed on sustainability. Episode 1 was about the framework, the systems that are out there, the things, the applicability, what you should look for. Episode 2 was the costs. How does it impact? What are the levers that you can pull? How should you find this low-hanging fruit? And lastly, a little bit of the future. And it's clear that what we need is action from government, leadership to create incentives to do what we'd all say is the right thing, and incentives to prevent us from doing what we would agree is the wrong thing. But the last question is to you. You spent time, thanks to our hosts at Execaire Aviation and the team at Execaire, Patrick, George, to Azzera, Puja, Anant. Thank you for participating. And on behalf of the Canadian Business Aviation Association, thanks for tuning in. The last question to you: what's your price? What are you thinking about aviation and sustainability? And how do you want to navigate a way forward? Thanks, everyone.